In my last video, I encountered a woman at the DC protests whose statements made me curious about a word that we have all heard before and that we know very well to have been contrived for the purposes of spreading radical leftist ideology. Since she seems to be very fond of doing so, I will let her do the talking here.
But the thing is like microaggressions are what we are dealing with now. This whole movement is about microaggressions.
Yeah, and this is what happens when microaggressions become macroaggressions.
Yes, and
right.
I mean, although like it's really cute, I mean, let's be very, very real.
Like I said, we have all heard of the word microaggression before, as it has been the subject of countless one-sided yet ostensibly open dialogues on race relations in the United States and throughout the West. The word seems to have fallen from favor since the height of its popularity around 2015, when it was named Word of the Year by the Global Language Monitor, and until that interview I was largely unaware that anyone still used the word unironically. I decided to do some research on what I thought was just a pre-Trump era neologism mainly limited to SJW good whites in the confines of liberal arts school campuses. But the word microaggression actually dates back to 1970 when a Harvard University professor named Chester Pierce coined the phrase to describe the kinds of remarks, questions, or actions that are supposedly painful to people of supposedly oppressed groups because they have to do with a person's membership in a group that's supposedly subject to stereotypes. And a key part of what makes them so supposedly disconcerting is that they supposedly happen so casually, frequently, and often without any harm intended in everyday life. I will let this speaker further elucidate the intricacies of the word.
Microaggressions regarding race are also very plentiful. Some people might be surprised to know that professing colorblindness can actually be a form of a microaggression. Examples would be, I don't see color. I was raised to treat everyone the same. I work in a diverse environment. I was in the Peace Corps. It's important to note, that is funny. It's important to note that mere proximity to people of color does not make someone woke. Nor does it make them automatically knowledgeable about social injustice issues. These comments actually deny the existence of people of color's experience in the world. And me personally, I've seen these phrases used in a defensive posture when someone's being challenged about something that they may have said that's offensive. What it actually does is shut down conversation, and it allows stereotypes to continue.
It is not too difficult to realize the staggering lack of self-awareness, the presumptuousness, and the entitlement that one must harbor in order to go about their everyday life just waiting for some perceived slight in everyday conversation, and by using the powers of mind reading to attribute such comments to the decidedly evil intentions of imaginary racists everywhere. To say that such a mindset would be paranoid would be putting it mildly, but the word and its potential for leftist language policing has potentially dramatic consequences, as described here by Dr. Jordan Peterstein.
A microaggression is any act, no matter how subtle, that makes the recipient uncomfortable regardless of the intent of the perpetrator.
Good grief.
Right.
Good grief.
Yeah, because we're getting away from intent, eh?
Yeah.
It's all consequence.
It's all how it's received.
Yes. And and that's being written into the law very rapidly, by the way. So we're moving from a legal system where intent matters to a legal system where consequences matter, which is really the eradication of the legal system. But it doesn't matter because the postmodern radicals who increasingly occupy the law schools believe that Western law is a patriarchal and oppressive tradition, and that undermining it and destroying it by doing things like removing due process and insisting on preponderance of evidence and going for consequence rather than intent, that's fine, because all they're doing is tearing down a terrible tyrannical patriarchal structure. Having never had the fortune to spend any time in an Iranian prison, for example, they're not very good at distinguishing between what constitutes a tyranny and what constitutes a free society.
So who is the man who coined the word microaggression? Dr. Chester Middlebrook Pierce. Well, by all accounts, he seems to be a model minority, and the very definition of an overachiever who managed, despite all odds and against all the racist forces by which he was undoubtedly beset, to succeed in America. His Wikipedia page is full of glowing achievements. Tenured professor of psychiatry at Harvard University, fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Science, celebrated author and guest lecturer at over 100 universities in the U.S. alone, Surgeon General of the U.S. Air Force, consultant for the Arctic Research Commission, the Peace Corps, even the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He was the first African-American college football athlete to perform on the playing field of a predominantly white university versus an all-white team below the Mason-Dixon line. He was even a consultant for the popular children's television program, Sesame Street. I searched for more information on this figure of such seemingly illustrious personage, expecting to find volumes teeming with fascinating details about his work in the Antarctic Peninsula, his humanitarian mission work, his practice in psychiatry, his contributions to Sesame Street, his consulting work at NASA and with the Peace Corps. Dr. Pierce only died 4 years ago, in 2016, at the age of 89, so surely there would be countless hours of his speeches available on YouTube and other platforms that he had undoubtedly given at Harvard and the Academy of Arts and Science and in many other such lofty institutions. Surely there ought to be more information on him, but with every search term and every search engine I tried, I was still coming up with the same few articles. On YouTube, just about the only thing I was able to find was the following video. A strange children's song is a tribute to Dr. Chester Pierce, of which I was only the second viewer.
Became high school president, went to Harvard twice. Look what he
Pretty strange. Also strange was when I searched for quotes by Dr. Chester Pierce, there was only one that ever showed up. And here it is from a speech Pierce supposedly gave in the 1973 International Education Seminar. Here it is, and I quote, "Every child in America who enters school at the age of 5 is mentally ill, because he comes to school with an allegiance toward our elected officials, toward our founding fathers, toward our institutions, toward the preservation of this form of government that we have. Patriotism, nationalism, sovereignty. All that proves that children are sick, because a truly well individual is one who has rejected all of those things and is truly the international child of the future." What does it mean when the only quote you can find on the internet from such a high-minded and accomplished individual is a 2-sentence paragraph with such obvious communist sensibilities? Really makes you think. With that quote in mind, let's take a look at the 45 declared communist goals entered into the congressional record in 1963. Let's pay close attention to numbers 17, 29, 30, 38, 39, 40, and 41. It is quite remarkable that what we see here reveals that it is highly possible that Dr. Chester Middlebrook Pierce was nothing more than a communist stooge, a useful idiot representing the lumpen proletariat, propped up by affirmative action policies and oligarchic interests to infiltrate the system and to spread subversive ideas throughout educational and psychiatric institutions. This is not a new idea by any means, and has happened many times before. There are many similarities in the story of how Marcus Garvey visited the NAACP headquarters for the first time in 1916, only to find himself the only black person there, surrounded by quote-unquote whites. When Garvey would eventually meet with KKK leadership and voice his opinions against integration and on his desire for blacks to return to Africa, he was swiftly replaced by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was much more pliant and sympathetic to the quote-unquote whites and the NAACP party line. And just as Martin Luther King's closest personal advisor and speechwriter, Stanley Levinson, was a quote-unquote white with communist leanings, it seems that there are similar forces at work in the story of Dr. Chester Pierce. Obviously, these patterns could be the subject of an entirely different video itself and may very well be someday. Now, I am very aware of the potential for some rich irony here. One could maintain that in what is obviously such a racist and systemically unjust white supremacist country, it could be seen as a microaggression in itself, that none of Dr. Pierce's work would be available on the internet for all to see. But I don't think that's what's happening here. If this information were out there, it would be easily accessible as yet another proud tale of black excellence. I think what we have here is yet another example of how subversive infiltration of Western culture has been perpetrated by the oligarchs using proxy warriors of the supposed underclasses. If only we could find out who seems to be disproportionately responsible for pulling the strings here. But to point out such a pattern, to notice who is behind the curtain here, just might be one of the biggest, most taboo microaggressions of all.
Very favorably to the story. They love that Dr. Pierce, the picture, they love seeing the picture, knowing that these were real people. They the microaggression, that term, when I go enter the classroom, normally they don't know what that term means, but when I walk out of the classroom, they do know what that term means, and then they refer to things that happen. They'll say, oh, that was a microaggression. That was a microaggression. And that makes me feel good because they got the verbiage, they're owning that word, and that gives them power. And so, I mean, it's very powerful to see how these little ones are being transformed, by this man and his story.
Environments. He was such a path breaker in so many ways. Do you see potentially wanting to tell other stories about him? Because I think you touched on something very strong, that white children or white people don't necessarily know that there's been important research done in Antarctica by a black man. There's been important work done in submarines under the Arctic Circle in the early days of undersea exploration, that a black man contributed to Sesame Street's creation, that a black man was an advisor to NASA for space exploration. There's so many stories captured in this one man. I wonder if you have intent to tell any of the other stories.
That's a great question. I've been asked to write other stories about other people, but I've never thought about that going even a little bit deeper within Dr. Chester Pierce's story. I'm open to that, definitely. Yeah, and I was actually in Nashville yesterday, and I learned that he did research in submarines, and I didn't realize. There was this doctor there from Harvard, and I just happened to we were sitting next to each other at this event, and I was like, oh my, and I started talking to him about Dr. Pierce, and it was just amazing how, he talked to me about the submarines, and it's just amazing how you're talking about that. So I always think that things are more than a coincidence.